The third and fourth of Wells' pioneering techniques can also be tied directly back to his experience in theater and radio. Wells put the idea of long takes and overlapping audio into the forefront of movie storytelling. Remember, before Citizen Kane, most scenes were 3 to 4 minutes long, routinely edited to give each actor their medium shot or their close-up during which they deliver their lines. But Wells was more interested in atmosphere and taking the audience into that atmosphere. He cast his films with his old friends from the Mercury Theater, stage actors who were used to memorizing entire plays and performing them live. Of course, to them, a 5, 6, or even a 7-minute scene was no problem. And why cut to a close-up when they can speak more naturally in a long take? In the coming decades, Stanley Kubrick reveled in long takes. Some of his most memorable are 2001 and The Shining. But Kubrick was using extensive long shots as early as 1957 with his war epic Paths of Glory. And Jim Jarmusch also embraces the use of long takes, as does Martin Scorsese and Alfonso Cuarón in his great post-apocalyptic sci-fi film Children of Men. And since Wells was using long takes and eschewing isolated shots for dialogue, then why would he have characters speak one at a time? In Wells' experience in radio, actors stepped on each other's lines all the time. Overlapping dialogue seemed more natural. And with long takes, shot in universal focus, Wells simply recorded his actors in one take and recorded all the overlapping audio right there on set, hiding the microphones all around the set and recording the audio naturally. In the 1970s, Robert Altman became known for his use of overlapping dialogue in great films such as Nashville and MASH. You can also see this technique in films written by screenwriters such as David Mamet and Paddy Chayefsky, who, it's no surprise, were also playwrights. Most recently, director Alejandro González Iñárritu used this technique in the 2014 Academy Award-winning film Birdman. But Wells wasn't only interested in expanding the visuals and audio of film with extended takes, deep focus, and deep overlapping sound. No, he was also contracting some of these ideas as well, using a minimalist approach for maximum effect. For instance, the fifth technique took this idea of huge sweeping film scores and whittled them down to just small musical cues. What Wells did in conjunction with his composer Bernard Herrmann is create short, 5 to 15-second pieces of music, just enough to give a hint to the audience of how the character is feeling at the moment. After a key event, or as the idea is just brewing. Or just a hint of music at the beginning or the end of a scene to let the mood settle or to emphasize the emotional impact at the end of the scene. But like I said, not a lot, just a hint of music. I'm not talking about a song, I'm talking about a cue, a short musical cue. Jim Jarmusch employs this technique in his fantastic low-budget film Down by Law. And you see the technique used frequently in other low-budget films because it's an effective storytelling technique. Yeah, of course, but it's also because scoring a film can be expensive. John Carpenter was a master of the musical cues in his horror films Halloween and The Thing, just as Christopher Nolan used it in his mind-bending crime film Memento. More recently, you can also see this technique used for great effect in the day-in-the-life biographical film, The Imitation Game. Wells also used these musical cues to bridge one scene to the next, and while that may not seem unusual, I was surprised when I learned that Wells was one of the first filmmakers to use dialogue and sound effects to bridge scenes together. In film school, you learn about these editing techniques all the time. They're called J-cuts and L-cuts. And forgive me this one digression, I think you'll find it interesting. This is a little inside peek into the editing process and business. J-cuts and L-cuts. The basic idea is this. In a J-cut, you hear something from the next scene before you see the scene. For instance, you might be watching a young man get ready for a date, and as he stands in front of the mirror putting on his tie, you hear the sound of someone knocking on a front door. Then you cut to the scene and you see that the boy is waiting at the front door for his date to answer. That's a J-cut. It's very, very common these days, but Wells invented it, or at least he brought it to people's attention. Now an L-cut is the exact opposite. The film cuts visually to the next scene, but we continue to hear the previous scene. Again, as an example, let's pretend that the boy's date is going well, he and his date are laughing and telling stories, and then we cut to the boy walking home. He's alone, but we continue to hear the stories and the laughter from his date in the previous scene. It gives us this feeling that the character is remembering the evening fondly as he walks home. But the sound is a carryover from the previous scene. That's an L-cut. And again, these sorts of transitions were not known to the general public before Citizen Kane. Wells just kind of thought it up and did it, and well, it probably didn't hurt that these sorts of techniques had been used in theater before the 1940s. But in film, they were brand new. J-cuts and L-cuts were used in a new and interesting way in the 1969 classic, Easy Rider. But you can also see them used in really creative and striking ways in the previously mentioned films Memento, Saving Private Ryan, not to mention this trippy sci-fi romance Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, written by Charlie Kaufman and directed by French director Michel Gondry. But back to Wells. The final technique that I'd like to share with you is the use of low-angle shots to make the protagonist, Charles Foster Kane, seem more menacing and larger than life. Now, Wells didn't exactly invent this technique. History tends to attribute this technique to filmmaker Leni Riefenstahl, who worked as a propagandist for the Nazis in the Third Reich. Most famously, she shot and directed the 1935 propaganda film Triumph of the Will. And in it, she always shot Adolf Hitler from a low angle. This made him look stronger, more important, like a hero. And the shot became known as the hero shot for that exact reason. And while Wells didn't invent the shot, he and Toland knew enough about the psychological effects of the audience looking up at the actors on stage to know that the camera position would influence the crowd's perception of Charles Foster Kane. And so Wells moved the technique into the realm of fictional storytelling on film, which was no easy feat. As I mentioned before, there were no ceilings in Hollywood sets because that's where they hung the lights. But Wells didn't care. He hired carpenters to build ceilings on his sets. Then he hired contractors to dig through the floors or dig trenches if they were outside so the camera crew could get below floor level and really shoot up at the domineering Wells as he portrayed Citizen Kane on the big screen. You see Christopher Nolan do this in the superhero film The Dark Knight to make Batman look more heroic and to make the Joker look more menacing. Kubrick also uses it repeatedly, as does Francis Ford Coppola, most notably in The Godfather, and so does Terry Gilliam, especially in his famous science fiction thriller 12 Monkeys. And when you think of the directors that Citizen Kane and Casablanca have influenced, Coppola, Gilliam, Nolan, Spielberg, Jarmusch, the Coen brothers, Brian De Palma, Frankenheimer, Fincher, it's striking. But what's more striking is the paradigm shift in filmmaking when these two films came out. But don't take my word for it. Do a little comparison for yourself. This might be a fun weekend of film watching. Consider watching 3 films in short order, one from before the 1940s and one after 1950 or so. I mean, you want to give the filmmakers time to be influenced. Make sure that they're in the same genre and pick some classics so you know that they're good films. For instance, a pre-1940 romance might be Bringing Up Baby. A war film, All Quiet on the Western Front. A thriller, The 39 Steps. Or a pre-1940 horror flick might be Frankenstein or Dracula. As you watch these classics, consider both the art of storytelling and the craft of filmmaking. Then, movie number 2. Watch a film in the same genre as this earlier classic, but make it post-1950s. For instance, compare Bringing Up Baby to The Graduate, Lolita, or Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. Compare All Quiet on the Western Front with Paths of Glory, MASH, or Saving Private Ryan, what have you. And then the third movie should either be Casablanca or Citizen Kane. I'm sure you'll notice both storytelling and filmmaking differences between your first two films. I want you to watch this third film as a bridge, as the missing link, if you will, between pre-40s Hollywood and the cinema that we enjoy today. By watching Casablanca or Citizen Kane in this context, I think you'll have a much greater appreciation of how these two films changed cinema. I know that I did. In closing, I'd like to quote the late, great Roger Ebert. He said, "You can have a movie with hardly any cuts, or very few cuts. That's fascinating. You can't take your eyes away from it. Look at some of the long takes in Citizen Kane." As I said, you don't have to take my word for it. Roger Ebert's word is pretty good too.
That's a cut.
That's a wrap.
And we are out.